Hello, my wonderful cellhorts, and welcome. Today I am hopping back in time to the medieval period once again, and I am going to be making a new belt pouch. This style with the ring inside of it for a bit of structure is seen in a lot of imagery, so it seems to have been a pretty common / popular style for a long period of time. I am making mine out of this this beautiful green leather that I have in my stash, and I've also got this ring for my inside structure. My ring is just a basic metal ring, 6 inches or about 15 centimeters in diameter, and this can usually be found in your either leather or macrame section of a craft store. I have already traced off my pattern onto a clean sheet of tracing paper so that I can tape this to my leather and not worry about damaging my original pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this masking tape and put little loops on the back of my pattern. I am also sticking the tape to myself first so that I can basically just get a little bit of fuzz from my shirt on my tape, and then I don't have to worry about it leaving a residue on the leather. Although this masking tape, painter's tape, whatever you want to call it, is fairly non-sticky to start with, so it's not really a big deal. But it's always something that's worth checking if you're going to be putting tape on the outside of a piece of leather. Make sure it either does not leave residue or it does not peel some of your finish up, depending on what kind of leather you're using. So, as I said, I am taping my pattern piece to my leather, which is already doubled over because I need 2 pieces. And I am taping and not pinning because pinning will leave holes in my leather, which will never ever go away, and I don't want that because a hole is a weak spot. And if I have a bunch of random holes, then I have to worry about the purse eventually tearing there. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a few loops around at strategic points, and then I am going to use a rotary blade to cut my leather out. And I can get away with using a rotary blade, and B, cutting this both pieces together at the same time, because as I mentioned, this is a fairly thin leather. It is not thick and it is not stiff, so it's pretty easy to cut double with just a rotary blade. If this were a much stiffer leather, or if it was much a thicker or heavier leather, instead of using a rotary blade, I would use an X-acto knife, and I would cut it one piece at a time. While I am taking care to cut my piece as neatly as possible, I am not stressing if it's not perfect, especially, again, because this is a soft leather. As I'm pushing my rotary blade through it, occasionally it's kind of catching on itself and folding a little bit. All I'm going to do is just go back and trim it off once I'm done. Again, just to get my pieces pretty even, but I'm not worried about them being perfect for this. Once it's stitched, all of the seam allowances are going to be on the inside, and no one's going to know. Now, to sew my 2 purse pieces together, I am going to just use a leather needle or a glover's needle and some nylon thread. I am using this gray because it stands out the least of the nylon thread I have in my stash. No, nylon thread is not, medieval, but it is used for modern leather work, and I can melt it so I can make sure my knots are super secure when I'm done stitching. So I am going to use a traditional double stitch, but I'm only going to use one leather needle while I'm doing this because the leather needle has it's basically a triangular cross section, and it is bladed. So if I were to try and do my basically double running stitch, with 2 leather needles, I risk basically slicing through the thread I've already put in the hole with the second leather needle. So what I'm going to do is 1 leather needle to make the initial hole as I'm sewing, and then my second needle that is on the other end of my thread is just going to be a blunt. I believe this is a size 20 or 22 tapestry needle, so it is blunt. It's meant to not do any damage to my threads. To sew this seam, along the sides and bottom of my pouch, I want to use 1 single very, very long thread. So I am just basically going to loosely measure it, make sure I have enough to make the entire length plus some extra, and then I'm going to double it. As I mentioned, I am using 2 needles on this 1 thread, and it is because I have 2 ends of my thread. So I'm going to start from one end and work towards, or I should say, I'm going to start from one end of my seam and stitch with both ends of my thread around to the other side of my purse. To make it a little bit easier for myself and to ensure that I have my thread middle centered when I start my seam, I am just going to put a quick slip knot over here at my fold end, so that when I start pulling my thread through, I can more easily find the center of my thread, basically. So, little slip knot, and then I'm going to put 1 needle on each of the ends of my thread. Now, I'm going to start finally stitching this seam with my leather needle. And I am going to start fairly close to my edge. Leather does not need a huge seam allowance the way fabric does because it's not going to fray. So I am pretty close to the top edge of my pouch here. For this first initial stitch, I'm going through 1 layer at a time, but that's just to make sure I'm lining my edges up nicely. As you can see, as I pulled my thread through, I caught on where that slip knot is, which was the whole point of it. And now that I have this going through, I'm going to pull my slip knot out. I'm going to hold on to that little center fold while I make my second stitch. And from the opposite side, so where my thread is coming out of my leather on the bottom, I am going to go in on that side with the blunt needle to make that first stitch. And I am also going to have my thread fold over the top edge just to give myself a little more structure, kind of locking in that first stitch and making sure my edges aren't going to wiggle. And I'm just going to pull it tight so that my thread rests right against the leather at my upper edge of my pouch. Really quick, I do want to take a second to just check and make sure my threads are still the same length, and then I am just going to continue stitching. I did not mark my stitch lengths or anything before I started this. As you see, I only sketched down a couple inches what my seam allowance will be, which is about 1/4 inch. And I'm basically just going to stitch this nice and easily by hand. And I'm not going to stress over stitch length or any of that stuff. I'm just going to go for it. So what I'm going to keep doing is I'm just going to do 1 stitch with my leather needle from one side and then go back in from the opposite side with the other needle. And I'm going to do that the whole way around the sides and bottom of my purse. All right, after spending a while sitting in front of my computer watching random TV shows, I am back with the fully stitched bottom and sides of my purse. As you can see, I've actually put my knot down in the corner rather than up at the top, and that is just so that I don't have the knot up right at the top of the opening of the purse. I've already tied 2 knots in my nylon thread, and to just further secure it, I am going to take a lighter and literally just melt the ends of the thread. It's honestly that easy. And I'm going to melt them down to the knot to just further secure and lock in that knot, basically. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in slits in the upper edge so that I can have my drawstring to close the top of the pouch. My I've got about 11 inches with my seam allowance, although I want to measure without, so about 10.5 inches. I am honestly going to just really quickly divide it and just make some slits, basically. I'm not super worried about it being perfect or even, because it's a leather drawstring pouch, so it does not need to be perfect. For better control with cutting these slits, I am using an X-acto knife rather than my rotary blade, basically just to make sure that my slits are on the same length on both halves of my leather. If I were using the rotary blade, the top layer would get cut further than the bottom layer, and I don't want that. Next, I am going to just quickly and with my chalk mark where the center of the fold will be, where the leather goes around the ring. As you can see, I've got two lines here on my pattern. Those are my stitching lines. I just want to mark the center, basically so I know where to line the ring up when I put it in, which is still not the next step. That's almost the last step. So the center of the ring is about 3 inches from my top edge, so that's what I'm going to mark here real quick, nice and easy with my chalk. Before I put my ring in, I want to do one more thing, and that is open up my seam allowances. And I'm actually going to be gluing them down, and I'm using a rubber cement. I could use contact cement, but A, I don't have any at the moment, and B, that requires ventilation, which I also don't have, and it's December, it's cold outside. So I'm just using this Elmers rubber cement, which is basically just a, I don't want to say a milder type of glue. It's the same idea, it's just not quite as toxic. So I am just putting in a line of glue the full width of my seam allowance from my edge to my stitching line, and then I'm just kind of eyeballing to get about the same amount on the other side of my stitching line, because I want to be sticking glue to glue, basically. So I am just going to go the entire way around my seam allowance, putting about a half an inch worth of glue on this edge. It's okay if it looks like it dries, because it takes quite a while to dry. So even though it's not shiny, because I am putting a fairly thin layer, it's still fine. So I am going to go fully around my first side, and then I'm going to basically just fold my seam allowance over on itself using my stitching line as the fold point. It's basically the same as pressing a seam open if I were working in fabric, but the glue will keep it open, and I don't need to either hammer it or try and press it, which you can press leather, but you have to be really careful about it. So while yes, this is a modern technique, I find it easier to just do this to get my seams looking nice on the inside. And once I have glued the first side the full seam allowance, I'm just going to flip this over and do the exact same thing on the other side. Once that is all done, I can turn my pouch right side out, and I am ready to put the ring in. I am putting a light line of glue along that chalk line I put a little while ago. As you can see, that'll just help me keep the leather from wiggling around too much as I am sewing it to the ring. So that's why I am doing this. It's not 100% necessary, but it just makes it a little bit easier. Now, my ring is a tiny bit smaller than the width of the purse. It's about 19 inches in circumference, while the purse is about 21. I am not worried about this extra 2 inches because I'll just kind of pull the leather a little bit. It'll fit fine, don't worry. So I am lining up one of my side seams with the seam in the ring, and I'm going to use the clips that I used earlier to just hold it in place. And I'm going to do basically a divide and conquer method. I'll start from one side and then I'll hop over to the other side and then just gently pinch the leather around the ring until I've gone the whole way around. And now for the stitching. I'm going to just do this pretty much the exact same way I did the other seam, which is 1 thread, 2 ends, 2 needles, and I'm just going to stitch around through my leather basically as close to the ring as I can get. I am pulling my thread a little tighter here as I stitch, but that is just because my stitching line is on the inside of the ring, and again my leather is a little bit bigger than the ring, so that just helps make it a little smoother basically. I am now back to the beginning where I started my stitching, and I want to hide my knot. I don't want it visible on the outside, so I'm going to use my blunt needle and just one side at a time go through only one layer of my leather to pull my thread through to the inside, so that I do that with both thread ends. And then on the inside I am just going to knot them and again melt my thread ends. And with that, I am almost done with this pouch. I do need to cut a couple more pieces of leather. One is going to be the pull for the drawstring at the top, and the other is going to be a loop so that I can actually hang this pouch on my belt. So I am just going back to my original piece. I want to use as little as possible, so I'm actually going to cut my drawstring piece from the little tiny leftover edge from when I cut the initial 2 pieces of the purse out, because that's a long skinny strip and I need a long skinny piece to make my drawstring. So I'm going to cut out of that instead of the main body of the purse first. And I don't need a huge piece for this. I am just going to cut myself a 1/2 inch wide strip as long as possible out of this little piece here. And once I get that cut out, I am going to then cut a slightly larger rectangle, and I'm going to use that to make my loop for hanging. Now I cut this piece 2 inches wide, but I only want my finished loop to be 1 inch. So I'm just going to go grab my glue again, and I'm going to basically fold it in on itself the same way I would with bias tape. So I am going to just completely coat the wrong side of my leather here with glue. And then I'm going to very carefully fold in each side so that they meet in the center. Now, when I was gluing wrong side to wrong side, it wasn't a concern, but now that I'm going to be gluing right sides of my leather together, I'm just going to take my X-acto knife and just kind of scratch up the surface of my leather a little bit, just to get it a little rougher so that the glue has something to stick to, so that I can turn this strip into a loop and then attach said loop to the pouch. Now I can't really use the clips here to position the strap while I sew it, but that's what the glue is for. The glue will keep it from moving around while I'm sewing it, and then it'll just help keep it in place once it is stitched in. And once again, I'm just going to get both of my thread ends on the inside and tie them off and then melt my threads the same way I've been finishing it for the rest of this pouch. And the final finishing touch is to just put the drawstring in through the slits I cut earlier, and I am using wooden beads at the end to keep from pulling this out accidentally, and also to add just a little extra bit of color to the pouch. And there is my new belt pouch, all done and ready to get used. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you would like to see more, you can check out this playlist right here, which has all of my medieval content. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you again probably in the new year. Bye!